I welcome you all to the final session of the SANEM International Development Conference SIDC 2020 on COVID-19 and development challenges. And this is a panel discussion session. We have completed 7 successful sessions of the conference. Now we are extremely delighted to have with us Professor François Bourguignon, Professor Vadim Mahmoud, and Professor Kunal Sen as panelists in this session. Professor François Bourguignon, Professor Vadim Mahmoud, and Professor Kunal Sen are very well known to all of us. However, in brief, I would like to say a few words about them. Professor François Bourguignon is Director of Studies at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, one of the most prestigious graduate schools of social sciences in Paris. He served as Director of the Paris School of Economics from 2007 to the end of January 2013. His work, theoretical and empirical, focuses on the distribution and redistribution of income in developing and developed countries. He is the author of several books and numerous articles in international economic journals. He received several scientific distinctions during his career and taught in several foreign universities. He has a wealth of experience advising several governments and international organizations, and between 2003 and 2007, he was the chief economist and the first vice president of the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Now I come to Professor Vadim Mahmoud, who is an eminent economist of Bangladesh. He was a professor of economics at the University of Dhaka. He acted as a member of the caretaker government of Bangladesh in 1996, where he was in charge of the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Planning. He is currently a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy, UNCDP. Professor Mahmoud is also acting as the Senior Country Advisor of International Growth Center, IGC, at London School of Economics, and the Chairman of South Asia Network of Economic Research Institute, SANEM. He has frequently consulted for many national and international organizations and has held visiting appointments at Cambridge University, IDS at Sussex University, IFPRI, UNDP, and the World Bank, amongst others. He was the co-founder and a former chairman of Polli Kormo Sahayak Foundation, PKSF, the apex organization for funding the microcredit programs of NGOs in Bangladesh. He was also the founder chairman of Institute of Microfinance, INM. He has authored several books and numerous journal articles on a wide range of topics in developing economics. Finally, Professor Kunal Sen has over 3 decades of experience in academic and applied development economics research. He is the author of 8 books and the editor of 5 volumes on the economics and political economy of development. Since 2019, he has been the director of UNU Wider in Helsinki, and he is a professor of development economics at the Global Development Institute, University of Manchester, United Kingdom. Professor Sen is a leading international expert on the political economy of growth and development. He has performed extensive research on international finance, the political economy of determinants of inclusive growth, the dynamics of poverty, social exclusion, female labor force participation, and the informal sector in developing economies. His research has focused on India, East Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. In addition to his work as a professor of development economics, Professor Kunal Sen has been the Joint Research Director of the Effective States and Inclusive Development ESID Research Center and a research fellow at the Institute for Labor Economics in Bonn. He has also served in advisory roles with national governments and bilateral and multilateral development agencies, including UK's DFID, Asian Development Bank, IDRC, and he was awarded the Sanjay Lal Prize in 2006 and Dudley Sears Prize in 2003 for his publications. A few rules for this session. Each panelist will have 20 minutes to make their presentation. After 3 presentations are over, we will have an open discussion session. The participants can write their questions, comments in the chat box, but I also request those participants who want to speak during this session, kindly let me know in the chat box or raise your hand, and you will be requested to complete your intervention in 2 minutes. With this now, I request Professor François Bourguignon, as the first presenter, a panelist, to deliver his presentation. And Professor Bourguignon, I can give you a gentle reminder that you have 5 minutes left at your 15-minute. Over to you, Professor Bourguignon.
Okay, thank you very much, Selim. It's a pleasure to attend, although from very far away, this conference on of course, I mean, the most important topic in the current days. And I believe this is true in all countries in the world. I've prepared some slides, so let me split my screen and go to, where are they? Sorry, I cannot find this, or it must be there. Okay. Okay, what I will, I mean, the first thing I want to say is the fact that it's very early for economists to talk about the pandemic, COVID-19, basically because we are certainly not at the end of the pandemic. In some countries, we have the feeling that we're already entering in a second wave. And in any case, economic consequences will be felt for a very long time. So because of that, it's an extremely difficult topic for the lack of data and the necessarily speculative aspect of all what we can say about the COVID-19. Yet, of course, there are policy decisions to be made, and these have to be made in at the middle of a lot of uncertainty. And this is not a reason why we should not speculate about what the COVID-19 implies. The angle I will take in my presentation is really the angle of inequality. And why? And poverty, of course. Why? Simply because it is completely clear that the first economic impact of the COVID-19, apart or on top of the health casualties, is poverty. The fact that many people in all countries, many people suddenly found it very difficult to survive simply because their basic income source was inaccessible anymore. And they had to live on really very, very, very little. And fortunately, in many cases, and we see that the government came to their help. But inequality also is important because in many countries, many people have said, what is really quite striking in this crisis is the fact that the pandemic has been exacerbating inequalities and to some extent revealing that inequalities were higher or more dispersed, more important in different aspects than what we thought. For example, people said, if you are living in a very tiny dwelling with 10 people sharing a single room, then the way in which you can go through the lockdown has nothing to do with people having a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment. And this is revealing not another kind of inequality, but another aspect of inequality that is linked to income, but which is not exactly income or consumption expenditure. And this is the reason why I thought that it would be interesting to speculate a little on the impact of the COVID-19 on the poverty and inequality. 5 points: casualties, health casualties, the cost of the lockdown, the indirect effects through the global economic recession, the likely legacy effects of the lockdown, and finally, the few remarks on some political economy issue. On the first thing, the casualties, I was a bit surprised to realize that the things were not as simple as I thought initially. There are not many, there is not much evidence today on who were the people who died because of COVID-19. I'm taking this chart from a very recent paper by Belgian economists who were able to match the people who died during the March to May 2020 period with the tax records of those people through their ID number. And this is, to my knowledge, the only case where there is definitely a link between the decile of income where people belong and belonged, we would say, and the mortality rate. And when you look at the top graphs, you see the excess mortality, which is, what is excess mortality? It is the difference between the mortality in March, May 2020 and mortality in the same months on average over the last couple of years. And what you see on this chart is for deciles of the income distribution, you see, and people who are above 65, you see the mortality, the excess mortality rate due to the COVID. And at least for men, it's a little less clear for women, but we see that we have a declining line or a declining relationship, meaning that the mortality rate increased more for poor people than rich people. And to some extent, this is what we're expecting. If we're expecting that the pandemic simply increased the probability of getting sick and of dying at the extreme, then because we know that in a year, the mortality rate is higher for poor people, then the increase in mortality should be higher for poor people. So this is what justifies making a correction and looking at the P-score, which is essentially the excess mortality divided by the initial mortality rate, the one before the COVID-19 pandemic. And here, you see that there is nothing really very clear. We have something which is a bit more or less flat, which means that in terms of mortality, from what we can, the evidence of a country like Belgium suggests that the pandemic hit people in the same way as standard diseases which lead to the death is hitting people. So I think it is an interesting point because a priori it is not something which was completely obvious to me and I think to the profession. And I thought it was an interesting point to mention. So it means that maybe the inequality issue is not on the side of the health dimension, but on the side of the economic dimension. Second remark on the cost of the lockdown. And this has been universally applied, maybe not in Sweden and a few countries. In most countries, it was coupled with teleworking, with a partial unemployment compensation for former employees. Depending on the country, people who were helped were in the formal sector were either employees or the firm owners. But there was definitely some help given to the whole productive sector. Informal workers suffered most. This is true in all countries, emerging countries, as well as developed countries, except for the fact that informality is less frequent in developed countries than in emerging countries. And in addition, we could say, but we just mentioned that in the previous remark, that those people were more exposed to the pandemic. Now, in most countries, in all countries, we would say, there was even for informal people some partial compensation given through cash transfer programs, which were more or less generous. And because of that, there was the impact on poverty has been less than what we could expect. And again, I tried to look for the I don't know what this is about. I mean, I don't know where this is coming from, but okay. So I look for some evidence on this. And there is a recent study by Nora Lustig in the US, which is about Latin America. And I would like to show you the result that she got. The study is the simulation is based on two assumptions. One, which is the fact that on average, the forecast by the IMF on the whole 2020 year will be observed. Second, that some people are at risk of losing their income in a country, depending on whether they are working in the essential sectors or non-essential sectors, whether they are working in the sectors which were locked down or sectors which kept open. And second, in order to look at the distribution, those people made several assumptions distributing the burden of the pandemic or the lockdown in different ways. For example, an assumption would be to say few people losing a lot, 10% people losing 90% people, or many people losing much less. And doing that, you could generate a series of assumptions which would lead to, on average, the average household, average person losing what the IMF says about the loss or the drop in GDP per capita. Now, the result of this are shown in this chart for 4 Latin American countries. An interesting case is the case of Brazil, because here we have a kind of paradox, which is the following. The solid line is the way in which the loss of income during the whole year of 2020 due to the lockdown, due to the crisis, to the pandemic. And this is the loss corresponding to each centile of the distribution of the distribution pre-COVID. And you see that in a country like Brazil, on average, we have something lost, which is around 10%, but very poor people don't lose as much as 10%, and people above the 7th or 8th decile lose less too. And so this is really what we expect, and what you have in the vertical line is the poverty line, where the poverty line is. And based on this, you can imagine that the poverty headcount has increased a lot in Brazil because of that. If it were not for the compensation, would have increased a lot in Brazil, more or less a 50% increase in the poverty headcount. So moving from 25% people being poor to almost 40% people being poor. So the impact on poverty is absolutely enormous, and this is true in all countries. But now we have the compensation, and the dotted line corresponds to the compensation. And you see that in the case of Brazil, the compensation has been extremely generous. So generous that, as a matter of fact, poverty has been declining in Brazil because of this compensation. This is not the case in Argentina, this is not the case in Colombia, this is not the case in Mexico, basically because there was no compensation whatsoever in the case of Mexico, which is one of the few countries, at least in the hemisphere, where this was the case. But in any case, you see that in Argentina and Colombia, the compensation has not been big enough to eliminate the big loss for not the middle class. I mean, the lower middle class paid a high price will pay a high price for the pandemic. So I think it was interesting to get an idea about the order of magnitude of the loss. I also should add something, which is the fact that This is a loss over 1 year. And this is a problem that this pandemic raises when we want to look at poverty and inequality, because maybe on the year, over a year, the loss will not be that big if the economy recovers before the end of the year.
Professor
But
Burgonian, you have
during the
5 more
lockdown,
minutes.
okay, during the lockdown, the increase in poverty has been enormous. And the impact during the lockdown has been on poverty has been truly enormous. So it is not clear that we can average like this and forget that during a year, there were 2 months which were absolutely terrible. And during those 2 months, the pandemic may have had an impact on lasting impact on the people. But let me move on. We know that this pandemic has created a global economic recession. If we were to believe, and I don't think it is the case, and this may be something that we may want to discuss in later, if we want to believe that this would be a recession like other recessions, then we would expect some ambiguous impact on inequality and definitely an impact on poverty, an increase in poverty. And in terms of inequality, we know that the crises have a very variable impact on inequality. Basically, because people at the bottom are losing a lot, and people at the top, who are the capital income, capital owners, are also losing a lot. So I don't think that we can say very much on that aspect, except the fact that it is making poverty still worse, but it was taken into account in the simulation that I just referred to. But again, the real issue is, are we in a standard economic recession? This is not clear. Most important, the legacy effect of the lockdown and the crisis. Health, not so much casualties of the pandemic, but the fact that children have been undernourished for some time during the lockdown, and this will have a major effect on them, especially on their learning capacity later on. So we may expect that this would be long-term impact on poverty and inequality. Same thing about schooling. Children who were in middle-class family, upper middle-class family could learn or could study at home with the help of their parents and with some equipment, but this was not the case for people in the lower middle class or, of course, for the poor. So again, we have a huge impact which will be felt for quite some time. And we could say the same thing for all the people who have lost their job, even if the economy recovers, and even if those people find a new job or find their job back, it is not unlikely that those people will suffer, will have have lost some human capital until for the future. And last slide, I believe so. It's very interesting to look at the decision process behind the whole thing, something that we observed in all countries. In most countries, the lockdown was decided, as I said before. And as economists, we would tend to think that the lockdown resulted from a very clear analysis of the trade-off between saving lives and minimizing the income loss of the people under the constraint of limited healthcare facilities. And really what happens was simply that there was no such an argument about what is the nature of the trade-off and what is the best point that we can choose on the trade-off. What I find interesting is the fact that in more or less all countries, we have seen countries moving from one constraint to the other. The first constraint was we have to save lives and we have to make sure that the hospital, the healthcare system, is able to cope with the demand coming from people with the disease. and until, of course, trying to avoid that the hospital system would be completely with congestion. But very quickly, the government realized that the cost of doing that in economic terms could be very high. Or they realized that it would not be possible to sustain the safety net that they had created, the compensation that they were giving to poor people for a very long time. So rather quickly, in most countries, government said, we have to get out of the lockdown as soon as possible. And maybe in some cases it was too soon. And this has been responsible for the fact that the virus started to circulate again and maybe generating the second wave now. But what I found quite interesting is the fact that in policy terms, and we're still there in this kind of situation, we are in a situation where governments are making decisions based on the idea that they have to survive, that the country has to survive until a vaccine is available or until some drug will be available to treat the disease. But it is somewhat interesting, I'm not sure interesting is the right word, to realize that those people, governments really didn't analyze the situation and didn't make rational policy decisions. And I think it is it's important to keep that in mind. It's very difficult to be rational in this kind of situations. I stop here, Selim.
Thank you, Professor Rugonion, for an excellent presentation. I think I'm quite sure it will actually instigate and generate a lot of questions and ideas for discussion, especially talked about the inequality challenges, the short-term and long-term intergenerational issues in the COVID-19 situation and the kind of response from the government and whether how actually we'll take this into consideration. Many thanks. I think it's an excellent beginning of this panel discussion. Now I move to Professor Vadim Mahmoud. I know probably Professor Vadim Mahmoud will talk about economic recovery. So, sir, if you could kindly unmute your microphone. So you have to unmute your microphone, sir.
Okay.
Yes, now we can hear you.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Tell me whenever I'm not audible.
Yes.
Am I okay now?
Yes. Yes.
Thanks, Selim. Thanks, Selim. Good evening. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see Francois, Kunal, my teacher, Professor Rahman Soban, and many other Ahmed Hassan I can see. Okay. I shall make some observations on the economic recovery, not post-pandemic recovery, which is a contemporary popular topic, but post-lockdown recovery. Because since the situation of the pandemic in many countries, including Bangladesh, is still unfolding, as Francois rightly said, and there's so much of uncertainty how this will wind up. And what should concern us most now is the lingering effect of the initial lockdown on the prospects of economic recovery and the restoration of the livelihoods of prospects of economic recovery and the restoration of the livelihoods of the poor, given the ongoing scenario of health situation, health front. I shall talk mainly from the perspective of Bangladesh, since the other two distinguished panelists have much better view of what happened globally. So what is happening on the health front? Bangladesh has followed other countries in its effort to contain the COVID-19 pandemic with the initial countrywide lockdown and measures to revamp its existing quite moribund health infrastructure. The lockdown had all the adverse impact, economic effect, but could not prevent the countrywide community level transmissions, mainly because of inadequate enforcement, including allowing some super spreader events like religious gatherings, mass movements of garment workers, because of indecisiveness of government factory owners, and Eid-related holidaying, and many other things like that. The current government strategy seems to be to accommodate some facilities of COVID treatment within the existing health structure to the extent feasible, and then help the economy regain the normal levels of activities, albeit with an appeal to comply with COVID hygiene in public places, which, however, remains mostly unheeded. One redeeming feature is that, for reasons not fully understood, the mortality rate of COVID is low in Bangladesh at 1.4%, even lower than India's 1.6%, and the global average of 3%, and much higher in Western countries. If you go by the official record, we know the deficiencies of the official record. Even then, this is a starting point. And in the absence of a surveillance system based on adequate numbers of tests to determine both extent of current infection and immunity acquired by past infections, there is no way of knowing the current status of the pandemic in Bangladesh, and so is also in many other developing countries. But the signs are that it is spreading unabated. People are not interested in getting tested, nor going to hospital unless it's essential because of poor service in the public facilities or high cost at the private facilities. Now, although experts believe that compliance with some simple rules like wearing masks, washing hands, or keeping physical distance in public places can provide almost 95% protection against the infection, most people are not interested to comply with these. And surprisingly, the government is also not keen on enforcing these, except communicating messages that often lack clearly defined, coherent, implementable guidelines. Instead, the government seems to be bent on going for full speed economic recovery. The hope is that, perhaps, I guess, that the process of infection will go through a slow burning process, as the epidemiologists say, without creating media headlines and embarrassing the government. One reason as to why the general public is not interested in COVID hygiene may be because individual risk from infection is less than the social risk. Individual risk of fatal or serious infections is indeed very low. And the government spokesman made a mistake of advertising that in the to start with. But what they ignored is that because the infection can spread several times more rapidly than ordinary flu, the absolute numbers of seriously affected people may be large, more than what the health system can cope with. This incompatibility of incentives, the individual and social versus social risk, is accentuated in Bangladesh by the fact that most of the working age population is in Bangladesh are young. Due to the age structure, we call the so-called demographic dividend, and they believe that there is a belief that they are less prone to serious COVID attack. Also, wearing mask is more to protect others as a matter of social responsibility rather than protect oneself, which is not entirely true. Add to that the inconvenience of wearing mask in humid, hot climate and the high urban congestion of economic activities in Bangladesh. As a foreign journalist once remarked, as I remember correctly, on his first visit to Bangladesh, that this is the only country where one cannot be in an open space without at least another person being inside. So physical distancing in such an environment is not always easy. And in terms of what are the policymakers thinking? In terms of their perspective, they know that even complying with simple COVID hygiene has economic costs in a country like Bangladesh. These costs are reflected in various ways. Investments needed to create more hygienic work environments in factories, fewer number of passengers carried by buses and other vehicles, suspension of services like ride sharing by motorbikes, which is a part-time job of many young people in Bangladesh now. Temporary shutting down of entertainment facilities like cinema halls and stadiums. I know India is going for a limited opening up of cineplexes. Then adequate spacing of roadside vendors and the time-consuming queuing of buyers in kitchen markets and so on. I remember the West Bengal chief minister, to start with, wanted to implement that queuing by making crosses on the footpath for queuing, easing of queuing, Mamata Banerjee. Now, this problem, the problem with this hands-off policy is whether full economic recovery is possible with an ongoing pandemic. The working class people will come out to regain their livelihoods. The office goers will have to attend duties if government desires them to do so. But as long as the infections continue to spread, the relatively well-off people will be hesitant to come out. If they think that the public places are not congenial in terms of COVID hygiene, and they'll be hesitant in their usual shopping or in re-employing household staff as far as they can avoid. This means lagging demand for products and services from which they're relatively poor earn their livelihoods. And if there is a spike in the incidence of serious COVID attack, God forbid, and there is more hospitalization, then the resultant scare will, of course, jeopardize economic recovery. As it is, one survey conducted by Bragg University with PPRC is a think tank, showed that the entrepreneurs, even now, small and large entrepreneurs across the board, remain worried about the future uncertainty and economic risks. So that affects their investment decisions. Excuse me. In this otherwise gloomy situation, there is some silver linings for the economic recovery of prospects in countries like Bangladesh. You see, Bangladesh economy does not depend on some of the worst hit sectors like the tourism hospitality business, as in the case of the Maldives, or Kenya's safari park-based tourism. Its main exposure to the global economy is through garment export and remittances received from migrant workers. So garment export has already recovered to the pre-COVID level. Although that may be because of accumulated orders postponed or initially cancelled by the foreign buyers. But even then, the export prospects for the coming years do not look too bad in spite of the sluggish global markets. Because Bangladesh, after China, even if it is second largest, still captures only a small market. So it's a competitiveness which will matter. There has been a surge of remittance inflow. Government is encouraged by that, but that may be partly because workers are remitting funds to their families in distress at home. But even then, the inflow will slow down, but still may sufficiently help the economic recovery. The rice harvest, luckily, have been good, helping food security, although farmers face marketing problems. Overall, unlike the industrialized economies, production processes in economies like Bangladesh do not have complicated supply chains and can recover much more quickly, both from the supply and the demand side. And the Bangladesh economy has had experience of coping with a history of coping with such catastrophes. It has a history of coping with floods and other natural disasters, and not least the prolonged episodes of shutdowns as part of political agitation. So we have some experience of how a shutdown economy can recover. For big businesses, the shutdowns have, of course, meant loss in terms of overhead cost of unutilized capacities, but most industries, including RMG and urban construction, use mostly semi-skilled labor who are plenty in supply, giving the employers the upper hand in sending them home if there is no work. This is true of most other urban formal sector businesses, including retail shops and malls, shopping malls, where employees could be laid off and sent home. A recent study by Bragg University with UC Berkeley, which was held a few days back, I was part of that, showed that the average pay of garment factory workers did dip sharply from end March to June, irrespective of their work experience or training or level of work position, which means this didn't matter for the employers. And their average wage level bounced back to the pre-COVID level by July, mostly because production factories resumed their normal production. This was so in spite of the government's early announcement of a generous stimulus package in terms of loans to the factory owners to pay workers' salaries during the lockdown. So what does all this mean? It means that restarting the formal economy is not that much of a problem. Maybe it will require some rescheduling of loans and some provision of some stimulus funds at low interest. On both these counts, the government has acted adequately given the pressure of the business lobby. But the loss of livelihoods of the poor and its restoration is a different story. The economic brunt of the lockdown was borne most acutely. Francois mentioned that, was borne in their cities by the informal sector businesses and their employees and people pursuing various petty professions, including rickshaw pullers, roadside vendors, small retail shops, housemaids, and so on. It was the loss of livelihoods of these people, along with that of the workers of the big formal sector businesses who could for temporarily lay down their workers, employees.
Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Yes, that is what resulted in the great urban to rural exodus, though not as great as India's. And that was followed by the so-called great lockdown. That soiled the rank of rural poor along with many stranded migrant workers, and the government's social protection program simply didn't have the capacity to cope with the relief effort given the poor delivery mechanisms and inadequate funding, although the government did make some extra efforts. Incidentally, this exposed a major weakness of our governance structure. The lack of representative, credible local governance is always a problem in Bangladesh, in implementing social protection measures, resulting in huge resource leakage and mistargeting. But the problem has now been acutely felt when the government has had to rely on the centralized bureaucracy with very little local knowledge to do the job, including identification of the new poor or identifying and isolation of the COVID-infected people. As Amartya Sen remarked, in the context of India, of course, that dealing with a pandemic like this should not be likened to a war, as many people do, with a centralized command and control system, but should depend greatly on local level initiatives. True, the lockdown was not much effective in rural and semi-urban areas, but nevertheless, that seriously affected many non-farm enterprises that cater to the urban markets due to the disruption of transport facilities. The enterprises such as poultry, dairy, and vegetable farms contribute to a large extent to the rural income and livelihoods. Many such enterprises have lost their working capital and faced closure. Thus, it is in conformity with what Francois was hinting at. Revival of the non-farm rural enterprises and urban informal businesses is key to restoring the livelihoods of the poor, much beyond merely reviving GDP growth. And this is the main challenge. The issue here is that how to assist small enterprises to tide over the crisis and save them from winding up, particularly since they lack effective political lobbies to attract the government stimulus funds. Yet the small enterprises, some scaled up from a subsistence scale and others starting through lateral entry, are extremely important for providing employment, for making growth more equitable, and for making the economy more resilient in the face of impending problems arising from the global economic crisis. Although in many developing countries, including in Bangladesh and India, we see much dynamism in the small scale sector in terms of scaling up of these enterprises and in the increase in their numbers, what is hidden is a lot of churning in and churning out. These enterprises typically need small amounts of working capital, which they may have lost due to lockdowns, so that a little help can make the difference between survival and remaining afloat. Although part of the government's announced stimulus package of concessional loans have been earmarked for small enterprises, delivery mechanisms pose a great challenge. Microfinance institutions, which are very strong in Bangladesh, can be a suitable vehicle for this, but these do not have much experience in working with urban businesses. Commercial banks have little experience or incentive for dealing with small businesses. And the agent banking introduced by some banks in rural areas in Bangladesh recently are more able to collect deposit than disburse loans. Now I can go on and on with a list of other challenges, like the problem of our banking system, through which all the stimulus package has to be channeled by the government, the problem that is faced, the problem of low mobilization of revenue, which is one of the stumbling blocks of how to help, how to increase social spending in the health and education sectors and in social protection sectors, and how to create a better environment for attracting FDI and also for diversifying our export beyond RMG, so that we can diversify our exports and can be more resilient to any slowdown in the global economy. Thank you. Thank you very much, Salim. Have I taken more than 15 minutes?
No. Sorry, you are very much within the time. Thank you so much, sir, for an excellent deliberation on economic recovery, challenges of the lockdown, in practicing the hygiene practices. And also you, towards the end, you talked about the stimulus package and the political stimulus package, and also the access of SMEs in the stimulus package. I think that will really generate a lot of discussion. Before Professor Kunal Sen, sorry, before Professor Kunal Sen starts his presentation, sorry, I would make a couple of announcements. I would request Professor Revan Sohan to speak after Professor Kunal Sen's presentation. And then I will also request the participants, those who want to really speak, please let me know in the chat box. So I will let you speak during the open discussion session. And also, I would really like to see that the panelists, they challenge each other. So I also want to have a kind of interactive discussion among the panelists too, see, in the open discussion. So Professor Kunal Sen, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you, Salim. First, I want to say it's a privilege to be in a panel with Professor Vadim Mahmoud and Francois Bouguin on both of whose work I deeply admire. So thank you for the opportunity to be in this panel. Secondly, I want to congratulate SANEM for the really excellent international conference. I've been looking at the papers and I was in some of the sessions in the last few days. I think it's one of the first to have an international conference on COVID in the South Asian region. It just confirms SANEM's reputation as a leading think tank in South Asia. So very well done, Sanem. Okay, so I want to speak a little bit about COVID-19 and the SDGs. I'll focus on two SDGs. I can't really cover all 17. I'll focus on the poverty SDG, SDG 1 and SDG 8 on decent work. But let me just first start off by putting up this slide, which tells you that the SDGs, the first question really should be, which SDG has not been affected by COVID-19? Of course, there are direct effects on some SDGs, clearly on inclusive growth and employment. We already heard about that from the previous panelists. So SDG 8 is obviously being affected very directly. Also, by definitional reasons, SDG 3 on public health. The pandemic is a public health crisis. But of course, we also know that there are effects happening on other SDGs. Quality education is mentioned by Francois Bouguin. Children not going to school. Gender equality, we're seeing quite significant increases within household inequality because women are, as both men and women are staying at home, women are doing more of the domestic work and looking after the children. We're also seeing, of course, effects on poverty, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And there are indirect effects happening also in SDG 16 because conflict-affected regions that we are seeing are the ones most likely to be vulnerable to COVID pandemic because there is a failure of state capacity in those regions. SDG 17, we've also seen a backtracking on globalization in the last few months. That obviously predates, that has also been happening even before that. But certainly there's been a retreat away from globalization in the last few months. And the one SDG where there's an ambiguous effect, because every other SDG is a negative effect of the pandemic, the one SDG which is an ambiguous effect is SDG 13, climate action. Because of course we have reduced, at one level we have less environmental footprints because people are not traveling as much by planes. But there is a reduced commitment to climate action because governments have other priorities now. So in a sense, we seem to see a very bleak picture about the 2030 agenda because of the pandemic. Now, let me talk about two SDGs. The first one is zero poverty. It's already been discussed to some extent by Francois, but I'll present other estimates here. I'm going to talk about two working papers we did in VNE Wider. The first was done in April 2020. Both have been are authored by Andy Sumner and co-authors. The first was in April 2020, the second in June 2020. The first was providing estimates of the impact of COVID-19 on global poverty. Second gave us a more country-level estimates. Now, on these working papers, the point is quite remarkable is the fact, if you see these graphs, what we have are different scenarios. First scenario is it a 5% fall in incomes across the board? Second scenario, it's a second middle graph, there's a 10% fall in income. And the third scenario, 20% fall in income. Now, clearly, it's quite obvious we're not looking at the first scenario. It's going to be much more than 5% fall in income across the global south. We're looking at more something between 10 to 20% fall in incomes. And then what this working paper, the first working paper did, on a different assumption of the poverty line, $1.9 basic poverty line, 3.2, which many people feel is a poverty line we should be using, or even 5.5. What is quite remarkable is, especially when you look at the 10% fall in income, the 20% fall in income, the sharp increase in poverty across the different poverty lines. In fact, the 20% fall in income, you can see the reversal on poverty that's been happening. So all this last few years, since the 1990s actually, poverty has been falling, right? We know that. But this, because of the pandemic, you're going to see a sharp increase in global poverty, whichever poverty line we use, 1.9, 3.2, 5.5, doesn't matter. You're seeing a sharp increase in global poverty because of the pandemic. Now, also in these papers that we have, which essentially are what they've done is estimated from these estimates are based on POFCAL-net. They also show us that if you go by the 20% drop in income, you can see the additional increase in the poverty income ratio. And what's remarkable is that we see that the poverty income ratio is going to increase by at least 5 percentage points, which is a big increase, to about 7 percentage points, whichever poverty line we use. Doesn't matter whichever poverty line we use. That's a very important message here. And secondly, and this is a remarkable finding, that if you go by 20% fall in income, you're looking at 500 million people going to be increased in poverty. In other words, 500 million additional people who are poor because of the pandemic. And that's quite remarkable. I also have some country level estimates. I'm going to go through that very quickly. And maybe the South Asia one is most interesting here. So on Central Asia, North, Central and Southern Asia, we don't really see much of an effect on headcount poverty, except for Uzbekistan. But for Bangladesh and India, we get big effects. For Bangladesh, if you use a 20% cut in income, you're going to see a 11% increase in the headcount ratio. Using only the $1.9, the lowest possible poverty line. And for India, staggering 14%. 14% increase in headcount ratios. Now you might say, why is that happening? And then, of course, if you translate into absolute numbers, you're going to get very big numbers because these are both are quite populous countries. Why is that the case? The reason is in both these countries, there were a lot of people just below the poverty line, just below 1.9 poverty line. So as a consequence, as we start seeing a fall in income and consumption, lo and behold, these people are going to be pushed into poverty. So they're just above the poverty line. So because they're just above the poverty line, the fall in income is pushing them into poverty. That's why we're getting these big effects in these two countries, Bangladesh, India, less of other South Asian countries. East Asia, pretty much not much, really. Why? Because in East Asia, we haven't seen a big effect on GDP as yet. And so in East Asia and China, of course, there's hardly any effect, which is probably good news because China has been one of the big contributors behind the falling global poverty. But, countries like Timor-Leste, for example, there's a big increase in poverty. Pacific, again, we're seeing big increases in poverty rates based on these calculations we have from these two working papers. I think what the basic point here is that the effect on poverty is asymmetrical across Asia. Some countries are going to be particularly badly hit. So in the case of East Asia, Indonesia, Philippines, Timor-Leste, for example, and Bangladesh and India in South Asia, and others not as much. And that's the interesting point. Okay, so now this work we did has been extremely well received in the media and also in the policy circles. The Economist had two articles, one in May, using the first of the working papers, this is the one here, the pandemic is plunging millions back into extreme poverty. And then just last week, there was a second article on the pandemic's effect using a second working paper. And you can see the graphs I've been using are from our working papers. The second Economist article was looking at, again, what has happened in the last few months. The Guardian had this article, coronavirus is going to turn back the clock 30 years on global poverty. 30 years, staggering, really. And so just to mention, the work has been very well received internationally. I want to talk a little bit about SDG 8, decent work, inclusive growth. I'm just going to put up these two graphs, one on GDP from the IMF's World Economic Outlook, June 2020. The October one is around the corner, because we know that the IMF revised this estimates of GDP growth significantly downwards from the April 2020 World Economic Outlook to the June 2020. So we don't know what they're going to say in the October WEO. But what is interesting is that in the case of Asia, you can see the IMF estimates a fairly muted effect on GDP. Why? Obviously, it's China. China's done relatively well. And of course, countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and so on. So this, if we were to segregate by region within Asia, South Asia would come out pretty badly, obviously. Of course, the effects we seem to be seeing is more in emerging Europe, Latin America, less so Asia, and less so Sub-Saharan Africa. As far as the employment effects are concerned, the first quarter, it was mostly an effect in China. We know that. The second quarter, you can see it's pretty much across the board. So working hours losses are now across the board, and they're big losses in working hours, according to the ILO's estimates, which are again model-based estimates. Now, one of the problems in working on this kind of question is almost all are using models, and it's a scenario building. And the reason is that the most labor force surveys have been halted. Primary surveys are completely relying on phone surveys, which have their limitations. There's absence of baseline data. There are lack of sampling frames in many cases, so samples one is collecting are not representative. So UNE Wider, which always believes in one of the being the early movers in this, we started collecting our own data. And what we did, we teamed up with ISER in Ghana to build up on what they've been doing. They've been doing this amazing panel survey. Now they have the 3 waves, and we used a sampling frame from the panel surveys, and we used a set of those who are in the 3rd wave, and we interviewed them. And we interviewed them in the last few months. We just got our initial results, and so it's very preliminary results, but I'm going to show you some of the results. And so we did this phone surveys between 19 August and 17 September, retrospective surveys, asking them what happened to their employment earnings in the last few months, pre-COVID and post-COVID. We also had this national income dynamics survey in South Africa, the NEET survey, and I'm going to just present something from there also. Okay, so what do we see? So we see that in South Africa, 40% of households lost means of income since lockdown started. And that's a country that is a middle income country, right? 47% said they didn't have enough money to buy food in April. That came down to 37% in June, but not a big decrease. And South Africa, as we know, has quite strong social protection schemes. In the case of Ghana, 62% of households said they had run out of money to buy food in April. But that reduced to 38% in August, by which time in Ghana, most of the lockdowns had been lifted in different cities. But even then, 41.6% of households said they have lost their means of income since lockdown started. And that's pretty staggering numbers. Interestingly, one thing from our Ghana survey is the following, that what's really worrying households is the fact that they might be unemployed or they might lose income. So 62% of respondents said that's the biggest concern by far. Not so much being sick or getting fear of getting sick or whatever else. It's really the fact that they may be unemployed or they might be losing their earnings. And of course, the reason why they're concerned is that almost 70% of them said the reason they stopped working was not because they were unwell. It was mostly because the business had to close down due to government regulations. In other words, lockdowns. Now, one thing that's interesting is that we are seeing in Ghana a return to not normalcy, but something better than what was going on in lockdown. So 47% of workers who were working in February had stopped working in April. April was a bad month, and that was the case, in fact, in many other, including here in South Asia too. 83% who stopped work thought that this break was going to be temporary. They felt that they're going to go back to work at some point. And 77% of those who stopped working in April were working again in August, September. That's quite a strong recovery in employment. And you can see that pretty much also in this graph on the right, which I'll not get into detail now. So as far as employment is concerned, our survey is suggesting a recovery. Not a complete recovery, but a partial recovery. But when it comes to working hours and earnings, we do not see that kind of recovery. So those who continue to work in August, September reported around 10% decline in working hours compared to pre-COVID into February, 15% decline in earnings compared to February. So the important thing we're getting from our initial results is that employment seems to have recovered largely, but working hours and earnings have not recovered. And it's still quite important to keep in mind that share respondents who reported running out of money to buy food or non-essential food items was still 13% lower, 13% higher in August, September compared to February 2020. So we are not seeing a full recovery at all. And that's something, and that's even when we have seen easing of lockdown in the case of Ghana, as in many other countries. Now, I'll just very quickly, I don't know how much time I'm sitting, but I'll just quickly talk a little about the policy responses.
You have 5 minutes, Professor Sen.
Okay, so because it's already been covered quite a bit by Francois and Professor Mahmoud, so I will not talk about it so much. But I think the point here really is that what we're seeing in developing countries, especially Africa and South Asia, is a bunch of policy measures like wage subsidies for enterprises, reduce the need to furlough fire workers, wage subsidies to informal workers who are not eligible for social security payments, subsidies for new employment and training, and subsidies designed to facilitate movement of workers from firms which are closing down or temporarily closing down due to experiencing due to labor shortages, payments to register self-employed. But the problem really is this big group of workers in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are informal workers. 85% or so is the estimate in both these regions. And their support has been mostly being confined through the social assistance programs, social transfers, because they're not getting very much of the wage subsidies. They're not getting very much of what the registered self-employed are getting. So the one huge problem right now facing Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia is what do we do with the informal workers? It's fine that you can reach out to the formal workers, either the formal self-employed or the formal average employed, but they are a small proportion of the total workforce. And that's a really big challenge that is not the same as in Latin America, not the same as in East Asia, and certainly not the same as in the richer countries, where in those countries you don't have to worry about this problem. And I think this is something that we need to think about. What do we do in this case? Yes, the scale of support has simply not been enough. We should really have been in a do whatever it takes policy mode. We haven't been in the do whatever it takes policy mode in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. In Sub-Saharan Africa, there's a specific problem. They have precarious public finances. And that was there even before the pandemic hit. Even before the pandemic hit, they were running into public debt problems. And now, with the pandemic's effects on tax revenues, they're in an even more serious problem. So they don't really have much of a fiscal space. In South Asia, there's a little bit more fiscal space, but we also have governments who are very reluctant to increase spending as a ratio of GDP, as you can see in India. There's a major problem of targeting. That is especially in Africa, I would say, less perhaps in South Asia. And as I said earlier, informal workers being left out of wage subsidy and loan guarantee schemes. And that's a real big concern. You've got to find a way to reach out to them. So that's my last point here, that the challenge really in South Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa is a specific problem of how to address the huge problems we've seen in earnings and also employment of informal workers. So let me stop here, Salim.
Thank you, Professor Kunal Sen, for an excellent presentation. I think you set out that the kind of challenges we have on attaining SDGs. I think these are very, very relevant for discussion today and also for the discussion in the coming days. So I would request Professor Sobhan, I'll just bring him in a minute or so. But before doing that, I will pose 3 questions to 3 panelists because I will come back to you for your response. And also there are a few questions on the chat box, and I know that probably also some of us participants would also like to talk. So for Professor Burgunian, I have a question on, you talked about inequality and also you brought about the issue on the stimulus packages in different countries. But do you think that the stimulus package also enhanced or brought a new dimension on inequality because of when it comes to the access of it? And we also heard from Professor Vadim Mahmoud the way in Bangladesh, actually, the SMEs and others, many other sectors also didn't get the kind of access to it. My question to Professor Vadim Mahmoud, you talked about first economic recovery is possible in Bangladesh because of the kind of nature of the economy, and you elaborated quite nicely on that. But at the same time, you also talked about the challenge in the livelihood, especially the livelihood will be, you think that, and also I think we all agree with that it will be under stress for some more time. But can you actually de-link these two from each other? So if we have a first economic recovery, why would not that lead to a better or recovery in the livelihood too? So what are the challenges there? And Professor Kunal Sen, I have a question to you. Given the kind of challenges you have provided in your slide and very nice in your presentation, do you think that we need to have a rethinking on the approaches of SDGs, approaches to SDGs, the current views on the SDGs, or do we need a renewed global discussion on development challenges, like the way we did in 2014-15 on Sustainable Development Goals? So with this, I will bring Professor Rehman Sobhan, sir, I'm requesting him to kindly unmute his microphone. Sir, if you can.
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, sir, we can hear you, sir. Please.
Oh, well, I hadn't actually intended to come in just to educate myself, so I shall just make two brief points. I think hearing all the speakers, one of the critical issues I think we will have to review both now and in the post COVID phase is the whole approach to poverty and poverty eradication agendas. We've been kind of obsessed with the numbers game and poverty lines. And the whole notion, particularly in the South Asian model, of in fact actually reducing levels of poverty, largely derived from improved GDP growth. Now, I think what the whole COVID experience has shown to us is the real fragility of the economic circumstances of large numbers of people who live not just below the poverty line, but also above the poverty line. After all, if you simply redraw the poverty line from $1 to $2, you will be automatically, in any case, taking many millions of people above poverty. But what COVID has demonstrated to us is slight exogenous shocks of this nature can really expose the fragile circumstances and the vulnerability of the poor, and that the great burden of this falls mostly on the non-formal sector, even though it also impacts on working people. What we have to really think now is that if you want to reconceive the approach to fighting poverty, you have to really address ways in which the informal sector can be, in fact, reinducted, or not reinducted, but properly inducted into a more formal component of the economy, in which you recognize the contributions they make. You, in fact, can cope with their enhancing capacity, and you have ways of dealing with them when you are, in fact, actually facing economic crisis. All these were complete unknowns as far as our people were concerned, and all you could do was then to try to pump in welfare payments to them and face great difficulty in doing so because the informal component of the economy is not particularly well connected to the ways in which the state really disburses its resources. The second issue, I think, which needs to be brought into mind, as and this has not really been discussed a great deal, I find, in much of the discussion, is the sheer weakness and profound inequity and injustice, which in fact really sort of drives the healthcare system in our societies. And we are already seeing the direct consequences of this in terms of the way that large numbers of people who, when you are faced with a crisis of this nature, are completely left vulnerable. They are served by an ill equipped state system, which is both poor in its coverage and weak, in fact, in its capacity to, in fact, deliver. I was going through your work on institutions with Professor Burgino, and I would have really have liked to seen another full section on the health sector because it would have been very appropriate in terms of addressing the institutional weaknesses of the health sector, particularly when you are facing problems of this nature. Here you have a system where the elite are in fact protected partially, though I must say in Bangladesh, COVID has had a much more democratizing influence on its incidence on both the well-off and the less well-off, as we can see in the high casualty risk. And we now see that they do not even spare the President of the United States. But as a general proposition, people who in fact get infected by COVID at the lower income levels were virtually left to God's protection rather than to in fact really have any access to a formal working system. And this, I think, is a major issue which needs to be addressed, both in terms of allocative priorities. I think the low allocations to the health sector, the inequity between a public and a private health service system, and of course the extremely weak and corrupt nature of the governance of the healthcare system, all of which in fact have really been capturing our imagination in very conspicuous ways. I would hope if you are going to add on any sort of further work to your work on institutions, that you would take a very deep look at the way in which we have faced with failures in the management of the health system and its completely inequitable incidents. I think these are two thoughts which I leave with you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I got few questions in the chat box, and I see that couple of participants also want to speak, so I will let them. But first, I read out some of these questions or comments. So the question, I think, by Dr. Dr. Abdullah Shibli, he will speak up, so I will not read out his question. But there's a question from a student from Dhaka University, Tanzimul Islam, to Professor Burgonion. And he said that as the second wave of COVID-19 begins in many countries, how should the governments re-evaluate the scenario to determine whether or not to enact lockdown protocols? I can see there is another question to Professor Vadim Mahmoud by same Tanzimul Islam. What are the necessary steps to rehabilitate the portion of the population which has had to migrate from the urban area to the rural homes? I can see another question from Paramita Aruni to Professor Vadim Mahmoud. In Bangladesh, small online businesses have taken over conventional businesses. So do you think the online business tend to be prolonged in post-COVID period too? How much expansion of online business affect the economy of Bangladesh? So I would, before going back to the panelists, I know the two persons, the participants, they want to speak up. Dr. Abdullah Shibli, I will request him to unmute, and then please, in brief, if you could speak. Dr. Abdullah Shibli, yes, please.
Thank you so much, Salim. It's a great pleasure to join this panel, these eminent panelists, particularly Salim and Professor Wahiduddin Mahmoud, who was my teacher at Dhaka University. It's my honor to be here in Boston addressing these panelists, especially for my colleagues from Dhaka University. I was teaching there many, many years ago. Anyway, I will address just two issues. And Salim, if I go over the time limit, please just let me know. As I think about the post-pandemic challenges that Bangladesh faces, I second what Professor Rahman Subhan said, which is the major headache for Bangladesh will be after we have more vaccines, how to phase it in and how to roll it out. Because without vaccination, Bangladesh, or for that matter, any country, will not be able to embark on the economic growth we desire. Bangladesh needs 8%, and whether we believe the Bureau of Statistics, which says 6% is happening, or 2%, as the Policy Dialogue Center says, vaccination. And how do we, in this environment, I don't want to reiterate what Professor Rahman Subhan said about the corruption. That's what
Dr. Shibli, I think we got your question.
The second point is to Kunal. Kunal,
okay.
I often mention in my writings that, and I echo what my good friend Abhijit, who is across the river from me, said, well, we need to re-establish these priorities. Can we let it go back to the 17 in the order it was originally faced. Can we rejigger the SDG? Is it time for folks like you who have some voice to think about, hey, how do we recalibrate in the next 10 years? Because if we go back to where we were, business as usual, things are going to fall apart. And we will, at the end of this decade, say, like many of the people say, and they don't tell the truth, that we have attained major middle class status or we have eliminated poverty and that sort of thing.
Dr. Shivli, I think we got your point, and actually you reiterated my point, which I actually also requested Dr. Kunal Shin to respond on whether we need to rethink SDGs. Thank you so much for being with us. So may I request now Professor Burgundian to respond first, then we'll go into the same order. You have to unmute yourself, Professor Burgundian.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to listen to Vadim Mahmoud talking about the issue of the recovery from the lockdown and the recovery from the economic recovery in Bangladesh. I mean, is definitely one of the wise men about the Bangladesh economy, and it's always a pleasure to listen to him. Likewise, it was also a pleasure to listen to Kunal and what he said about the SDGs and the work, very good work done in wider about global poverty, and I think contribution of wider to all this has been quite important. Maybe I have a couple of remarks on what both Wahid and Kunal said, and I believe this ties up with the question that you asked, Selim. It seems to me that in the analysis that Wahid Mahmoud gave us of the recovery in Bangladesh, we should make a distinction within the informal sector between two parts. I agree that the formal sector may recover rather quickly, and maybe more quickly, as a matter of fact, that in industrialized countries, basically because there is more flexibility in the labor market, and as you said, these sectors can lay off people temporarily. So because of that, it is probable that the recovery may be rather fast. In the informal sector, I would make a distinction between those informal workers whose work depends essentially on the demand, but does not depend on supply factors. This would be all those informal workers working on services, roadside vendors, cleaning ladies, etc., etc. Those people can recover extremely quickly, and to some extent, they are completely complementary with the formal sector. So as soon as there is more demand for their services coming from the formal part of the economy, they will be back to work. Which means that the real issue, and this is, I believe, what you said, but I believe it is important not to put the whole informal sector in the same bundle, is really about those small and medium enterprises which are informal, or which are formal, as a matter of fact, and have been badly hit by the crisis, and have seen their working capital in particular dwindling, so that they are not able to go back to work for quite some time, or they will have to simply stop their activities, or they need to have some loan coming from the banking system. And we know that in this part of the economy, it is very difficult to get to channel a loan to those people. So I would say that the real issue is in this part of the economy, and I think it is important to mention it, because this means that from a policy point of view, this means that this is a very particular part of the informal sector that one maybe should be targeting. And this answer to some extent the question asked by Selim about what would be the impact of the stimulus package. the impact of the stimulus package definitely will be indeed will be favorable to the formal sector, to the bottom, to make example, of the informal sector, and it will be this kind of middle class or lower middle class that will be affected by the, which will not be benefiting as much as the other from. So I think it is this distinction in terms of who is hurt and who will be benefiting from the recovery is important. And this distinction within the informal sector is quite important. My second point is about redistribution channels. There was, I mean, this has also been discussed by Kunal. When we talk about wage subsidies given to firms, it is not clear to me whether those wage subsidies are really directed toward the employees or whether they are directed to the employers so that they can keep a higher share of employees. The difference is quite big because you might say that what you want to protect is really the employees, or at least the salaries of the employees. And it is easier to reach those people through firms, moreover, because social security system are there that you can you can keep track of those people. And at the same time, you could say, fine, maybe subsidizing firms is important per se. But the point is simply that indeed, it is not possible to reach those people in the informal sector in the same way. And so Kunal said that because of that, it is important for the social assistance system to be working better, to be more effective in reaching the people. And I believe if there is one lesson to be taken from this crisis, is precisely that, is precisely the fact that given the organization and the institutions in the economy, it is easier to reach formal employees or formal people in general than to reach informal people, whereas should be possible to do to develop channels through which it would be easy to send cash to people. In all the countries which have developed conditional cash transfers, it is easy to increase the transfer from a day to the next. And moreover, with the new ways of channeling money through a mobile phone, etc., it's very easy to reach people. Now, the point is really to understand or to find or to develop the channels through which nobody would be really left behind, because the conditional cash transfers are targeting a specific group of people, not necessarily all the people who would be in trouble because of a crisis like the COVID crisis. So my point here is simply to say that this crisis should be an opportunity to think more about redistribution channels and to make sure that everybody can be reached effectively through by redistribution. I had the same point on SDGs, so I don't make it. One point on Kunal's presentation about the change in poverty, it seems to me that the headcount of poverty is not enough in that situation. You really need to say something about the distribution among the people. Because when you say that some people are moving from the top or from something above the poverty line and are getting below the poverty line, fine. But you also have many people who are moving from half of the poverty line to 10% of the poverty line. And this is much more serious than the others. So to get an idea about this, it's absolutely necessary to use other poverty measures than simply the head count. And two very quick last remarks. On the second wave, the point or the question which was asked to me. I mean, I can talk about it because my country, France, is possibly facing this second wave. And what I can tell you is that governments in Europe will do all what they can to avoid a new lockdown. So they will take a lot of decisions which are short of the lockdown. Probably the most extreme kind of measure would be to have a curfew and to say nobody is out after 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night. This would be, I would say, the extreme case, because they realize that the economic cost, not only the economic cost for the country, not the macroeconomic cost, the microeconomic cost and the welfare cost of the lockdown has been truly enormous, and they don't want to repeat that. Now, there is another aspect which will link with my last point, which is the fact that we are making progress, not in terms of vaccination. I mean, I hope that we're making progress in terms of vaccination and that the vaccine will be available in the coming months, in the coming 12 months or something like that. But we're also making progress in the way in which we treat the disease. And the big thing has been that the mortality rate of people who have been hospitalized because of the COVID has dropped enormously. And this means that today we have a huge number of cases, much bigger than during the peak in March or April. And the number of people who are dying is much less than it was before. So because of that, it is possible to deal with the virus might circulate much more widely without the huge health cost that we would have faced in March or April. And this learning is important, and this ties very well with what Professor Rehman Soban was saying about the healthcare system. I'm referring to progress being made in the treatment of the disease in advanced countries. Now, the problem is that in the emerging countries like Bangladesh, it is not clear that the healthcare system is making this kind of progress. And I think that Professor Rehman is absolutely right in saying that this pandemic is an incredible opportunity to realize that the healthcare system in Bangladesh and many other countries in the world is not able to address or to respond to this kind of a situation. And it is not because there is a lack of lack of equipment and the best or the highest technology cannot be used. The point is more about the healthcare facilities available at a lower level. I think that it is a good point to say that more attention should be given to that key sector. And this is really revealed by the pandemic. But again, thank you. I very much appreciated the presentation by Wahid and Kunal and the questions, and also by the other people who intervened. And thank you very much, Céline.
Thank you, Professor. Probably we'll come back to you again in the final round. So before getting to Professor Vadim Mahmoud, there are a few points or comments in the question in the chat box. I thought of reading those. So Pratik Bardhan, he says to Professor Vadim Mahmoud, urban-rural migration is believed to have a profound impact on the society. How should the government shape it up in the coming days? Rajaul Korin, he posed a question. RNG is the mainstay of Bangladesh's economy, but it could not establish a health insurance system for the vulnerable workers of this sector. Sir, would you please mention what are the main challenges for establishing a health insurance for the vulnerable groups? Dr. Ahmed Hassan, for Professor Vadim Mahmoud, he posed this question. Has there been any evolution of the government stimulus programs that were almost wholly channeled through banks? If so, what have such evaluations shown and what lessons can be drawn? What is the evidence on the programs for SMEs in both rural and urban areas? Dr. Simon Bidisha posed this question. I think this is for all panelists. The long-term effect of COVID-19 on school dropout and on skill formation, in bracket, not being able to invest in higher education, is overlooked. How to prioritize this? This is a wake-up call in government policies, and what should be the effective strategies? I think there is another question from Pratik Bardhan to Professor Mahmoud. So far, CMSME sector has received only 21% of the stimulus package. The whole package is a bank-centric one, but they have miserably failed to reach out to the small enterprises. Do you think that NGOs can act as a channel of communication between banks and these enterprises? So I can see one question from PP Shahu to Professor Kunal Sen. State business relations inter alia a key correlate of economic growth. How do you see the kind of changes in state business relation in India's economy during the COVID period and how it is going to impact the growth figures? Thank you. Then Dr. Ahmed Hassan also asked to Professor Kunal Sen and Professor François Bourguignon, what is the international evidence of the impact of COVID-19 on the assets of the SMEs and the poor in general, however small they were in the first place? Presumably, there can be long-term adverse consequences of an erosion in in these assets. What should be the government policy response be? I can see one question from Mahatabuddin to Professor Bourguignon. Don't you think the current pandemic will lead to a development divergence among the countries? Poorer countries with lesser policy options might fall further below than the richer ones. How do you think the poorer countries can tackle this challenge of intra-country inequality when they are seeing increasing xenophobia, global trade tensions, etc.? So I think I'll stop here. These are the comments and questions I have received so far. So Professor Vadim Mahmoud, if you could, sir, unmute and could respond to some of these questions, and then I'll come back to Professor Kunal Sen.
Too many questions I have forgotten, but I
Yes,
remember
sir, you
some
can
of
prioritize.
this.
Yes.
I'll prioritize, of course, your question. This is, you said that whether the current government's implicit strategy of delinking the going full speed for economic recovery on the one hand, and doing some, I would say, lip service to COVID hygiene and things. Can they coexist? I mean, as I said, I mean, in my presentation, that the economy cannot gain full strength without containing or without knowing more about how this pandemic is spreading in the community. There is some, we know so less about the virology and epidemiology of this disease that as economists we are almost helpless. We don't know how things will shape up, whether in the viruses will become weaker from next infection to next infection. Just a few days back, there was a results from Bangalore scientists who could separate between symptomatic and asymptomatic infected people in Andhra Pradesh, and their results, which is not yet peer reviewed, is that which is I mean good result. I mean encouraging result is that asymptomatic infected people far outnumber the symptomatic people, but they spread normally only asymptomatic type of disease. So we don't have to worry about those who are hiddenly, but the symptomatic patients do spread symptomatic disease, and the higher is the more serious is the symptoms, the more serious type of infections they will spread. Now, these are all remain speculative. That's why it's so difficult to predict anything. Why in Bangladesh, death rate is low. Nobody can know. There are hypotheses, but nobody knows. If we think that we don't have to live with indefinitely with this disease, we have to. If you don't learn how to live with this disease, then our hope is inoculation. Now, the problem of inoculation in Bangladesh is related to the first is related to the weakness of the health sector, where even in child immunization, where Bangladesh has surpassed most of the developing countries, there is a divide between rich and poor still. Now, with this health structure, how to inoculate crores of people. Even before that, you have to identify who are the candidates, because who are already infected and have the resistance. This is a huge task beyond the capacity of Bangladesh's. They cannot even test a few thousands in a day. The second is the question of cost. China has offered, India may have its own, Kunal may have its own vaccine. Bangladesh has been offered by China 26,000 vaccine free. What will you do with that? They have costed a vaccine at a minimum of $250 per vaccine. So even if the vaccine is available, and unless there's a local producer who can have some arrangements, we have to wait until there is leverage from international aid agencies and international philanthropies to help provide the necessary funds. As I said, as Professor Rahman Saban has rightly pointed out, that this pandemic has exposed the extreme fragility of the health sector and shows the problem of depending too much on the private sector health providers, which not only has become ineffective now at a stage of crisis, but also is a very unequal system in terms of access. Now, many people give plaudits to Bangladesh and some other countries in making tremendous progress in increasing longevity, mainly through through the decline in child mortality, which was possible because of some low-cost solutions like immunization, diarrhea treatment by oral saline, contraceptive adoption, which also lower the death rates of children. All these were campaigns which bypassed the main health infrastructure, administrative infrastructure. So further progress and dealing with crises like that, it won't be possible. We haven't discussed the problem of the loss in human capital, if I may add. The lost school years. That some universities and some schools have introduced online teaching, but this is creating a divide between rich and the poor. And it is so sad for a country like Bangladesh, which has done so much of progress and is lauded for its enrollment in primary and secondary enrollment, where the gender gap is even reversed. Now, all these gains may be lost if this pandemic continues in this way. About one comment about Kunal's thing, about Kunal's all the findings I find very, very useful. But when reporters pick this up, like even the reporters in the Economist, they may blow up the implications. like saying that we will be pushed back by 30 years, which may not have been your conclusion. I mean, there is a derailment, but if things really can somehow get to normal, then we can come back to the original situation with some lost years, which will mean that we can come back to the path, but with a dip in between. So there will be some lost years. Some other things like RMG, health insurance. This crisis has revealed a precarious situation not only of RMG workers, but also of the new poor, which were not covered by in any case, inadequate the social protection system. And it is strange that there was no arrangement, there was no incentive given by the RMG factories for the workers to create a provident fund where there could be some contribution. Even microcredit borrowers, given the incentive, have saved. And we know that 1/3 or even more of 5 or 6 billion worth of funds that revolve are the savings of the microcredit borrowers, poor borrowers. So it's really a question. It may be because the employers think that these are floating workforce, so they don't care about. And the nature of contract is semi-formal, so that's why this sort of arrangement is not possible, giving health insurance or saving provident funds and other things. About whether, stop me whenever you like, about how to absorb the new poor in the rural economy. It has been asked by some students. I don't think this is a long-run solution. It cannot be. Bangladesh has one of the, compared to other countries at similar level of production, is one of the most diverse rural economy already. And the non-farm sector, compared to the agricultural sector, even in rural areas, provide more livelihoods already. Maybe because of microcredit, because of other things. So it can't, it's almost to rest its full potential. It cannot absorb more from the urban areas. That will be a reversal of the entire development process, where actually the normal process should be the other way. This is an abnormal situation where, as Francois was saying, that unless we are thinking in terms of Professor Rahman Soban, who always thinks radically about changing the entire structure of the economy to be more equitable, if we are to go back to a system which is maybe unequitable, but at least that's a system which was reducing poverty and giving employment, then we have to think about the links between formal and informal sector. Which are the links where we should give more emphasis and think of policy innovations of how to gap those links. And after all, the informal sector and formal sector all have evolved as part of a general equilibrium system supporting each other. They didn't just grow independently, that if they are destroyed, they'll be destroyed forever. But the crucial question, the problem, as I discussed in my presentation, is that particularly in Bangladesh, even unlike India, but more like East Asian experience, Bangladesh's the decadal economic census, which enumerates all enterprises, was showing that Bangladesh's small-scale enterprises was the most dynamic sectors in the entire economy. The enterprises with 1% enterprise scaled up to 4% enterprise, 4% enterprise scaled up to 10 and 15 and 20% enterprise. That dynamism was there. That was the strength of the Bangladeshi economy, and much more of a strength, I will say, than remittances and RMG, because they help our balance of payments. But for the domestic economy, is the scaling up of small enterprises which were more important. And that's why it's so important of how to reach them in terms of their lost working capital and restart them. As I mentioned, that there is so much of, their net number grows, but there is so much of the mortality and birth rates of small enterprises are very large. That's hidden in the average, in the aggregate statistics. And it's so important not to let the firms to close and to encourage even lateral entry of others. Now, as I said, NGOs can do it in rural areas, although Bangladesh government has some apathy towards the NGO sector, going back to Muhammad Yunus and other things. I don't want to go into that.
So may we come back to you for in the final round to address because the time constraint. We can thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. So we'll come back to you in the final round. But may we request Professor Kunal Sen to respond some of the questions, because I can see there is another question by Dr. Amin Masood for Professor Kunal Sen. In many developing countries, including Bangladesh, I think the low number of COVID testing partially reflects the state capacity. Moreover, lack of data is another significant issue in targeting the affected. What do you think? How policymakers should address this data poverty issue? Jubair Hossain, he said one of the biggest challenges of implementing the SDGs is financing the SDGs. Bangladesh has been working on the integrated national financing framework for accelerating the achievement of SDGs. However, in the post-COVID-19 world, what are the added challenges for a country like Bangladesh who can face mobilizing the domestic resources for financing the SDGs? So, Professor Sen, over to you. And after you speak, we'll go back to the panelists for another final round in very brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Stadium. Actually, in my case, I find that the question has been asked and have been responded so well by Professor Mahmoud and Francois. There's not much I can add here, really. But let me just talk about SDGs. You know, one mistake we might make is we might think that before the pandemic, things were quite okay with the SDG agenda. No, it wasn't. We see the December 2019 progress report on SDGs. Almost all the SDGs except SDG 1 on poverty, there was quite clear evidence that we will not meet the indicators on the other SDGs. So in any case, even before the pandemic, we were not going to achieve the SDG, the 2030 agenda. So let's just keep that in mind. Of course, now with the pandemic, it's going to be even more difficult. But I think the other thing that I think, this particular situation we have has highlighted is often thought of the SDGs in silos. SDG 1 versus SDG 8 versus 10. Well, we can't anymore. I mean, SDG 3 on health suddenly has become the most important SDG that has all its effects on other SDGs. So I think that hopefully what might get out of this is not to think in silos. The other thing is the secretary will be talking about building back better. Now, we don't want to go back to business as usual. And so whether that will happen or not is, of course, the important question. Are we going to learn from the experience and try to build back better? I mean, just as an example, if you see the huge increase in social protection schemes around the world, especially Africa and Asia, will they be rolled back after the pandemic, after we get the vaccines? Or will we make sure that the social protection schemes become absolutely central in the fight against poverty? So these are the questions about building back better, so I think it's important to keep in mind. One thing I want to also respond to Professor Soban about the public health issue. Let's take Africa versus South Asia. So now we know that Sub-Saharan Africa is doing much better with the pandemic. We know that now. There's enough evidence of that. Death rates are far lower. So even if you might not believe in the case, the fact that there's not been testing going on in some countries, one can easily see from the mortality rates that Sub-Saharan Africa is doing much better. Why is that? Well, one argument that one has been hearing is that Africa, especially West Africa, did very well in fighting Ebola. They learned from that. And so the public health facilities were all already geared up in fighting those sorts of outbreaks. So one thing to keep in mind that this pandemic is very specific in its implication for public health. And we already saw that even in East Asia. Taiwan did very well. Hong Kong did very well. Why? They've already had experience fighting SARS. So there is a specific implication of the pandemic for public health. And that's why Africa is a very interesting comparison for South Asia, because Africa, from what one can see, is not going to have the same mortality rates that we see in South Asia, even though it's got so much more weaker capacity, state capacity, and so on. And that's a really important point to keep in mind. Another point to keep in mind is that, and this was mentioned in the keynote lecture by Professor Roderick in the first day, that South Asia's trajectory, and Sub-Saharan Africa also, is very different from East Asia. So we saw this movement of workers into unproduced services into informal sector activities, mostly self-employed. And that's exactly why there's a big challenge in South Asia. That's not the case in East Asia. And the problem right now is that what we're seeing is that are we going to see a social contract with the informal worker and the state? Because the state never took these informal workers seriously. They were really absolutely not ever taken into account. I mean, look what happened with migrants in India. So aren't they going, instead of a new social contract with informal workers? Because now you realize that these workers were so badly affected by the pandemic. I'm not that optimistic, I have to say. I don't necessarily think the state of South Asia would use this opportunity to think of a new contract with informal workers. And that's because the nature of the system we have, where the economies are already tilted towards informalist activities. So I'm not very optimistic that we see a reversal of what we already have seen in South Asia towards more like East Asian type productive structures, where people have moved from agriculture to more productive services or manufacturing. So I'm not very optimistic on that. Now, let me just go quickly a couple other questions. One is on the